Picture the best possible life you could build for someone you love. Not just comfortable, perfect. No hunger ever, no thirst, no sickness, no landlords, no bills, no predators, no weather. A climate-controlled world where every physical need is met before it's even felt. Now imagine you actually got to build that world, for real, and hand the keys to 8 strangers. And imagine that 5 years later, every single one of them was dead, and not one death could be explained by anything a doctor would recognize. No virus, no famine, no violence from outside. They simply stopped being able to live in a place that gave them everything, except a reason to. That is not a thought experiment. It happened. It happened to mice, inside a box, in a research facility in Maryland. And the man who built that box spent the rest of his career trying to figure out whether he had just seen a preview of something much bigger. No cause of death would have shown up on an autopsy. No pathogen, no toxin, no wound. If you had walked in during the final weeks and pulled a body off the floor of that enclosure to hand to a veterinarian, the report would have come back clean. Normal weight, normal organs, normal blood work. And still, one by one, an entire population went to zero, inside a room where nothing was ever denied to them. That gap between nothing was physically wrong and the whole population died anyway is the entire reason this experiment refuses to stay buried in an old academic journal. Something killed him that a scalpel could never find. His name was John B. Calhoun, and by the time he built the experiment that would make him famous, he had already spent almost 20 years asking one question that most people never think to ask at all. Not what happens when a society doesn't have enough. Almost everyone has thought about that. Wars get fought over it, economies are built around it, entire fields of study exist because of it. Calhoun wanted to know the opposite. What happens to a society that has too much?
What happens when scarcity, the oldest pressure in the story of life on Earth, simply gets switched off?
Calhoun trained as an ethologist, someone who studies animal behavior in something close to its natural context rather than in a sterile lab cage, and that background shaped everything he built afterward. He wasn't interested in running mice through a maze for a food pellet. He wanted to watch an entire society form, argue, mate, raise young, and fall apart, the same way you might watch a town rather than a single resident. Colleagues who worked with him over the decades described a man who would stand at the edge of his enclosures for hours at a stretch, simply watching, taking notes on individual animals the way a field biologist might track individual elephants or wolves, giving them informal names and personalities in his own records long before any of it made it into a published paper. He started small. In the late 1940s, working out of a research station in Maryland, Calhoun fenced off a patch of land, a little under a third of an acre, and stocked it with a handful of wild rats. He gave them unlimited food, unlimited water, unlimited nesting material. No cats, no hawks, no disease outbreaks, nothing hunting them. In theory, with that kind of abundance, the population should have exploded to fill every inch of the enclosure. Rat colonies are extraordinarily efficient at converting resources into offspring. Calhoun's own calculations suggested the space could have supported several thousand animals comfortably. Instead, the population leveled off at around 200, and then something stranger happened. It didn't grow past that number, no matter how much food sat untouched in the hoppers. Calhoun watched, and slowly he understood.
It wasn't the food running out. It was the roles running out. There were only so many good nesting sites, only so many territories worth defending, only so many places in the social hierarchy that actually meant something. Once every one of those positions was filled, the rats being born into the colony had nowhere left to go. They weren't starving. They were, in a sense, far stranger than starving. Unemployed. That single observation became the thread Calhoun pulled on for the rest of his life. He built version after version of the same basic idea, in barns, in custom-built rooms, using rats and then mice, each time refining the design, each time trying to isolate exactly what it was about crowding that broke a population apart. By his own count, he ran this experiment in one form or another more than 24 times over roughly 2 decades. And there was a problem that kept interrupting his results. He kept running out of room. Every single time a colony started to show the collapse he suspected was coming, the enclosure simply couldn't hold enough animals for the pattern to finish playing out. He would see the beginning of the story, never the end.
So in July of 1968, working now for the National Institute of Mental Health, Calhoun built something big enough and controlled enough to finally let the experiment run all the way to its conclusion. He called it Universe 25. The number wasn't dramatic flair. It was simply the 25th time he had tried this. He had learned something from each of the 24 attempts before it, and this was the version built to survive contact with its own results.
The enclosure was a metal pen, roughly 9 feet by 9 feet, with walls tall enough that no mouse could climb out. Inside, Calhoun built up rather than out. 16 vertical mesh tunnels ran from floor to ceiling like stairwells, and they connected to a honeycomb of nesting compartments stacked along the walls, which Calhoun, with a very particular sense of humor, called walk-up apartments. Food hoppers were mounted throughout the structure, stocked automatically, never allowed to run dry. Water was piped in continuously. The temperature was held steady. The bedding was clean. By any physical measure you could put a number on, this was as close to paradise as a rodent has ever been given. Calhoun calculated the space could comfortably house somewhere in the range of 3,800 mice. It would never get remotely close to that number, and the reason why is the entire story. On day 1, 4 breeding pairs went in, 8 mice total, healthy specimens pulled from an established colony. For the first 100 days or so, almost nothing dramatic happened. The mice explored the structure, mapped out the tunnels, worked out which apartments were desirable and which weren't, and began doing what mice do when nothing is stopping them. They bred. And once the first litters were weaned and started breeding themselves, the population began doubling on a cycle of roughly 55 days.
That kind of doubling time sounds abstract until you watch what it does over a single year. A population that starts in the single digits crosses 600 by month 10. It's the kind of growth curve that looks flat right up until the moment it doesn't. Somewhere around day 315, with roughly 600 mice now sharing the structure, the character of life inside Universe 25 started to change, and it changed first for the young males. Here's the mechanic that mattered. In a wild mouse population, when a territory fills up, the mice who can't secure a spot don't just sit there and take it. They leave. They migrate outward, find open ground, and start over somewhere the competition is thinner. That escape valve is built into how mouse society normally handles crowding, and it's one of the main reasons wild populations rarely reach the kind of density Calhoun was engineering on purpose. Inside a sealed metal box, that escape valve didn't exist. There was nowhere else to go. Every territory that could be defended, every apartment worth having, every established position in the dominance hierarchy filled up, and it filled up fast, because the older mice who had claimed those positions early were still very much alive and in no hurry to give them up.
That left a growing number of young, physically healthy males with nothing to do, no territory to hold, no mate to court because females were already paired off with males who controlled real estate, no fights worth winning because winning would only gain you a spot in a hierarchy that had no openings anyway. Calhoun started referring to these animals as the withdrawn. They collected in loose, listless clusters near the center of the structure, away from the nesting areas, and they largely stopped doing anything that resembled normal mouse behavior. They didn't fight for status. When a dominant male did attack one of them, which happened often since dominant males were highly strung from constantly defending territory against a rising tide of surplus young males, the withdrawn mouse frequently wouldn't fight back at all. He would simply absorb the hit, move a short distance away, and go still again. Not every excess male responded that way. A second group formed at roughly the same time, and they went in the opposite direction entirely. These males became hyperactive and indiscriminate, moving constantly through the structure, attempting to mate without going through any of the courtship behavior that normally precedes it, pushing into nests that weren't theirs, ignoring the aggression that would ordinarily have driven off an intruder. Calhoun documented instances of males attempting to mount other males, juveniles, and animals that showed no receptivity whatsoever, a total collapse of the courtship script that governs mouse reproduction under normal conditions. Between the two extremes, the shut-down males and the disinhibited ones, there was almost nothing
left resembling the ordinary middle ground of mouse social behavior. The females didn't escape this either. As the chaos in the central and lower levels of the structure intensified, a number of females retreated upward into the highest, most isolated nesting compartments and essentially opted out. They stopped breeding, they stopped engaging with males at all, they lived alone, groomed themselves, and simply waited out a situation they had no way to fix and no way to leave. Calhoun noticed something else during this period that he considered just as important as the social collapse, something he named the behavioral sink. Food was genuinely, verifiably available at every hopper station throughout the structure. There was no reason for any mouse to go hungry or to compete over food specifically. And yet the mice began to cluster obsessively at a small number of feeding stations, piling on top of each other to eat in a crowd, while other completely identical and completely stocked hoppers elsewhere in the structure sat almost untouched. The presence of other mice at a feeder had become in itself a stronger pull than the food. Being where the others were meandered more than eating efficiently. The behavior wasn't rational by any resource logic, it was social gravity, pulling harder than hunger, and it made the overcrowding at those hotspots even worse than the raw population numbers alone would suggest.
Then it reached the nests, and this is the part of Universe 25 that even Calhoun, a man who had spent 2 decades studying this exact kind of breakdown, found difficult to write about clinically. Raising a litter successfully required a mother to defend her nest continuously against the rising tide of directionless, aggressive activity moving through the structure. Under normal density, males shared at least some of that defensive burden. Inside Universe 25, males had grown exhausted and erratic, and defense increasingly fell on the mothers alone, on top of the demands of nursing. Some mothers began attacking intruding males with a level of aggression that occasionally spilled over onto their own pups. Others, overwhelmed,
simply abandoned nests mid-litter, carrying pups partway to a new location and dropping them before finishing the move, scattering offspring around the structure with no one tending them. In the most crowded, most chaotic sections of Universe 25, fewer than 1 pup in 20 survived to weaning age. And there were documented instances, which Calhoun reported plainly and without embellishment, of mothers eating their own young, something virtually never observed in a wild or lightly stocked mouse population. Calhoun wrote later that by this stage the colony had already died once, even though the bodies were still walking around. He meant that the social structure, the web of roles and relationships that actually makes a colony function as something more than a pile of individual animals, had come apart completely, well before the population itself began shrinking. The second death, the physical one, hadn't even started yet. The first death, the death of the structure, had already happened. What came after that first death is, to me, the strangest part of the entire experiment, because it produced a generation of mice unlike anything Calhoun had documented in 20 years of running this exact kind of study. The pups who survived infancy during the worst of the chaos were raised, if you can even call it that, by mothers too exhausted or too erratic to provide anything resembling normal maternal behavior, in a social environment that offered no example of what a functioning adult mouse life even looked like. There was no model to copy. Every adult around them was either withdrawn into stillness, locked into pointless aggression, or isolated in a high nest alone. And the mice that grew up inside that vacuum turned out fundamentally different from every generation that came before them in Universe 25. They didn't fight. They didn't attempt to mate, ever. Not even when paired later with completely normal, healthy mice from outside the experiment in controlled follow-up tests. They didn't build nests. They didn't defend territory because they had never seen territory worth defending. What they did, almost exclusively, hour after hour, was groom themselves. Calhoun called them, with a phrase that has outlived almost every other detail of the experiment, the beautiful ones. Their coats were flawless because they never got into a single fight worth marking their fur. From a distance, glancing into the structure, you would have looked at the beautiful ones and seen the healthiest looking mice in the entire population. Up close, they were something closer to functionally absent. They had opted out of being mice at all, in the deepest behavioral sense of what that means. They ate, they slept, they groomed, and that was the entire remaining content of their lives. The population of Universe 25 hit its ceiling on day 560, at roughly 2,200 mice, well under half of what the physical structure could have supported. It never went any higher. From that point forward, birth slowed, then nearly stopped, as more and more of each new generation turned out to be beautiful ones with no interest in continuing the cycle at all. The last successful pregnancy inside Universe 25 was recorded on day 920. After that, nothing. No new mice were born into the enclosure.
Ever again. The population that remained simply aged in place. The withdrawn males kept withdrawing, the beautiful ones kept grooming, the isolated females stayed in their high, empty apartments, and one by one, with no births to replace them, they began dying of ordinary old age. By the spring of 1973, not quite 5 years after Calhoun sealed the first 8 mice inside, the last one died. A population that had peaked above 2,000 had gone completely, permanently extinct inside a structure that still had food in every hopper and water running through every line. When Calhoun published his results, the world reached for the simplest possible headline. And honestly, it's easy to understand why. A perfect world handed to a population with nothing left to strive for, collapsing into extinction anyway. It fit almost too neatly into every existing fear about modern life. Urban planners cited it as a warning about high-density housing. Social commentators cited it as proof that comfort itself was corrosive.
That struggle was somehow necessary for a species to stay functional. Calhoun's own language didn't exactly discourage the darkest reading either. In a paper published in the early 1970s, he wrote plainly that for an animal as behaviorally complex as a human being, there was no obvious reason a comparable sequence of events couldn't lead all the way to extinction. That line got quoted constantly, in places well beyond behavioral biology, for decades afterward.
But if you actually read what Calhoun believed the mechanism was, rather than the headline version people extracted from it, the story gets more specific and more useful than comfort kills. His real argument wasn't that abundance itself was the poison, it was that abundance, unaccompanied by anything else, produced a population that grew faster than the number of meaningful roles available to it. Food and water and shelter were never the limiting factor inside Universe 25. What ran out was function, status worth having, work worth doing, a place in the structure that meant something to the animal occupying it. When the number of mice needing a role outstripped the number of roles the environment could actually offer, the excess didn't quietly disappear. It broke in one of two directions, either shutting down entirely or becoming destructively erratic. And eventually it stopped reproducing altogether. That distinction matters enormously because it's also the exact point where later scientists, revisiting Calhoun's data decades afterward, started pushing back hard on how the story got told. A science historian named Edmund Ramsden spent years going back through Calhoun's original notes and publications, and he came away with a more complicated picture than overpopulation causes societal collapse. Ramsden pointed out something easy to miss in the popular retelling. Not every mouse in Universe 25 fell apart. The animals who managed to secure and hold a defensible territory, even inside that crowded structure, continued behaving in a completely ordinary way, raising litters, defending space, living out something close to a normal mouse life. It was specifically the mice who couldn't establish any stable territory or role at all who spiraled into the extremes Calhoun documented. Ramsden's read is that the real driver wasn't density on its own.
It was unavoidable, inescapable social contact without the ability to control your own space or your own position within the group. Crowding, in other words, wasn't the disease. Crowding without any way to opt out of it was. Other researchers who tried to extend Calhoun's findings into actual human contexts ran into a wall almost immediately. Human beings, it turns out, are considerably better than mice at inventing new roles out of nothing. We don't just compete for a fixed number of pre-existing positions in a hierarchy the way a mouse colony does. We build entirely new categories of status and meaning that didn't exist before. New jobs, new subcultures, new forms of achievement, new communities organized around interests nobody had even invented a name for a generation earlier. A psychologist named Jonathan Friedman ran a separate line of research in the 1970s, specifically testing whether crowding alone produced the kind of breakdown Calhoun saw in mice, and his results suggested density by itself wasn't nearly as destructive for humans as the mouse data implied. What seemed to matter more was whether people felt they had any control over their own social environment, any ability to choose their level of interaction rather than have it forced on them constantly. So the honest version of this story isn't we built mice a perfect life and it killed them and the same thing is coming for us. It's something narrower and in a strange way more useful. A population, animal or human, that runs out of ways for its members to matter to each other doesn't stay stable just because its physical needs are being met. Meaning, status, purpose, whatever word you want to use for it, functions less like a luxury sitting on top of survival and more like a resource in its own right, one that can run out even while every hopper in the building stays full. Calhoun himself, and this is the part almost nobody includes when they bring the story up at a dinner party, never actually treated Universe 25 as his final answer. He spent the rest of his career, all the way up to his death in 1995, going back into new versions of the experiment, deliberately changing the design, trying to find whatever ingredient a population needed in order to keep functioning even under extreme density.
In some of his later enclosures, he added more physical complexity, more rooms, more separated spaces, effectively giving mice more ways to avoid unwanted contact and more distinct roles to occupy. And the destructive spiral he documented in Universe 25 became noticeably less severe. He genuinely believed there was a way through this, not for mice specifically, but for us. He wrote about something he called ideational generativity, the idea that as physical territory runs out, as literal square footage per person keeps shrinking on a crowding planet, a species like ours has an option no mouse colony ever had, the ability to keep manufacturing new territory that isn't physical at all, new ideas, new networks, new categories of contribution and connection that don't require a literal patch of ground to defend. He thought that was our actual way out, if we were willing to keep building it on purpose rather than assuming it would simply appear. It's worth sitting with why this particular experiment, out of everything ever published in the history of behavioral science, is the one that keeps getting dragged back into public conversation every few years, usually attached to whatever anxiety happens to be dominant at the time. In the 1970s, it got attached to fears about global population growth. Later, it got attached to arguments about high-rise housing and urban density.
More recently, in a strange twist Calhoun couldn't have anticipated, it's been dropped into conversations about declining birth rates across some of the wealthiest, most comfortable countries on Earth, nations where physical survival has arguably never been easier for an average citizen, and where fertility rates have nonetheless been falling for years. Whether that comparison holds up under scrutiny is genuinely contested among the people who study it professionally, and it probably shouldn't be treated as a settled explanation.
But the fact that people keep reaching for 8 mice in a Maryland laboratory more than half a century later to make sense of a modern trend they find unsettling tells you something about how much this particular story still unsettles us. It's shown up again more recently in an entirely different conversation, one about loneliness. Public health researchers in several countries have spent the last decade documenting a steady rise in adults, particularly younger adults, who report having few or no close confidence at all, even while those same people are more digitally connected than any generation before them. You can be reachable by hundreds of people at any hour of the day and still be functionally alone in the way that matters. The way Calhoun's withdrawn males were surrounded by other mice and still cut off from anything resembling a role. Some researchers studying this trend have drawn a version of the same distinction Ramsden drew about the mice. The problem isn't contact exactly. Endless low-stakes digital contact is easy to get and doesn't seem to fix much on its own. What seems to matter is whether a person has a role that other people actually depend on them for, a specific, irreplaceable place in someone else's life. That is a much harder thing to manufacture than a notification, and it's not obviously something a bigger apartment or a better job title provides by itself either. None of this means we're mice in a bigger box, quietly waiting out the same ending. Every serious researcher who has revisited Calhoun's work agrees on that much. But it does mean the specific mechanism he stumbled onto, that a body can have everything it needs and a society can still come apart at the seams because there's nothing left worth doing inside it, turned out to describe something real enough that people keep recognizing pieces of it in their own lives. Half a century later, in a world Calhoun never lived to see. Here's what I keep coming back to, out of everything in that box. It wasn't the food running out. The hopper stayed full for 5 straight years. It wasn't disease, it wasn't predation, it wasn't the temperature or the water or the bedding. Every physical condition a veterinarian could have checked would have come back within normal range, right up until the very last mouse died of old age with nothing left behind it. What ran out was something you can't measure with a food hopper or a thermometer. A role worth filling. A reason for the next generation to want to keep the thing going. Calhoun didn't build a story about mice. He built a mirror. And he spent the second half of his life trying to figure out what we'd have to keep building on purpose so that what we saw reflected back wasn't the same ending. The mice never got a choice in the matter. Once the door of that structure closed, the experiment ran itself to its conclusion, no matter what any individual mouse wanted. We're not sealed into a box. We get to keep deciding what counts as a role worth having, what counts as work worth doing, who counts as someone worth being connected to over and over again, for as long as we're willing to keep inventing the answer instead of assuming it'll show up on its own.
That was Calhoun's actual bet, at the end of a career spent watching populations collapse in rooms he built with his own hands. Not that comfort was the enemy, that meaning was the missing ingredient, and that unlike a mouse in a sealed metal box, we still get to go looking for it.